You're listening to Midnight Society with Tim Weisberg on Midnight FM.
And welcome back into the program. And we are going to continue on with our guest, Douglas Wellman, for the remainder of the program. All right, well, let's get into it with Doug about this other book, because, you know, we talked with you. Of course, it's fun to talk about things like comedy and the career of somebody like John Byner, and even with, you know, talking with you before about Howard Hughes and about the mystery around all of that. This story seems, you know, kind of along those same lines, a forgotten story of history, but also something that is a much more serious kind of tale.
Yeah, this is a true story that has not been told for 75 years about the bombing of Hiroshima. And I tell you, for a guy like me, who's a history buff and who, you know, I've been a student of World War II for many, many years. And having this story come to me, for me, was like finding the Holy Grail. It is just totally unique. It's about a family that not only survived the bombing of Hiroshima, but they weren't Japanese. They were actually Russian aristocrats who had fled from the Bolsheviks. They got out of Russia just ahead of the Bolsheviks, literally, you know, by the skin of their teeth. They got out of Russia by hijacking a ship and going to Hiroshima, starting a new life, and then having an atomic bomb dropped on them. And they survived.
Well, so, you know, why did they choose that of all the places they could have gone to? How'd they end up in Hiroshima?
They really didn't have a choice. It was kind of interesting. This is the story came to me from a man named Anthony Drago, who's the co-author of the book. This is the story of his family. It was told to him by his mother, Kaleria Palchikov. And their family had several centuries in the Russian aristocracy as supporters of the czars. And, you know, they were in a position of wealth and prominence. And then the Russian Civil War broke out. And the Bolsheviks under Lenin, of course, were out to topple that whole aristocracy, not just to topple it, but their goal was to kill all of them so that none of them could ever you know, come to power again. And of course, they started by killing Tsar Nicholas and his family. And when the Civil War broke out, Tony's grandfather, Sergei Palchikov, joined the White Russian Army. He was a colonel, and they fought the Red Army, but it was a losing battle. They got pushed all the way across Russia to the East Coast at Vladivostok, and they had nowhere else to go. They were being pushed into the Sea of Japan. When they reached Vladivostok, Sergei met Tony's grandmother, and they had Kaleria, so that now it was him and his wife and his baby, plus his men and their families. And they knew that they were days away from being basically slaughtered by the Bolsheviks. And so Sergei was standing by the docks one day, and he looked out and he saw this cargo ship, and he said to his men, I'm going to take that ship. Are you coming with me? And they did. And they hijacked the cargo ship. The families got on it, and the ship was heading to Japan. And so they said, well, I guess we're going to Japan. And that's how that worked out.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the map. I never realized just how close Japan is to Russia.
Yes. And there's another thing. In those days, they had just fought a war with the Japanese, the Russians had. And so they're heading for Japan. They really weren't sure how they were going to be treated. Are they going to be friends or enemies? They were, you know, but the Japanese, it was a very interesting situation in itself. If you could imagine that the family, aristocratic, their whole world is built around honor and nobility. Hijacking ships was about as far down the line as you could get for something that they would ever do. But, you know, they had no choice. It was that or they'd all be killed. And interestingly enough, the Japanese cargo ship captain had sympathy on him. And he said, okay, look, when we get to Japan, you're going to be international criminals as hijackers. You're going to be in a lot of trouble. But I tell you what, if you just surrender your weapons to me, we'll just play this like you are refugees instead of hijackers. And the Japanese government accepted that. It did not charge them with piracy. It accepted them as basically stateless individuals and allowed them to live there. So that was kind of a miracle all in itself.
And once they get there, how are they treated? I mean, are they treated just by the citizens? Are they treated like as outsiders, or by the time the bombing happened, just doing quick math in my head, we're talking about what 30 something years. So do they become part of society there?
It was really very interesting. The Japanese citizens, their neighbors, treated them very well, and of course, the family did not speak Japanese. Sergei, before he joined the White Russian Army, had been trained as a lawyer. So, of course, those skills were no good to him. They didn't speak Japanese. So he found himself in a situation where he was working as a laborer, basically, anything he could do to feed his family. But music had a big place in their family for generations, and he was an extremely skilled musician, basically a virtuoso on 7 instruments, including a custom violin that had been made specially for him. And he was practicing his violin one night after laboring at whatever he was doing. Came home and he played his violin to soothe his wife and just for his own enjoyment. And housing construction in Japan wasn't all that sturdy, so it could be heard quite a ways around in the neighborhood. And he was so good, somebody said, well, you know how to play professionally. And he started out by playing, the movies were still silent in those days, and they had musical accompaniment. So he started by playing with some of his Russian friends and Japanese neighbors, playing musical scores in silent movie houses. And so he didn't need to speak English. All he needed to do was be able to read read the music. And while he was doing that, he learned to speak English, and he actually became a rather well-known musician. So it was just one of those things where he had this opportunity to actually earn a good living while he was learning the language. And then someone heard him in the movie theater playing and asked him if he would come to a local school, start an orchestra, teach violin. And so he went. So the community, in relating to your original question, was very supportive of him and the family initially. But then he actually became a rather prominent part of the community through his work teaching their children and as a talented musician.
And that's going to be, though, still quite a change from being part of the aristocracy to now having to find work as a laborer to take care of your family.
That was, you can imagine how hard that would have been for someone complete cultural change and to not even know the language, but then essentially to work his way up from a laborer to being a prominent member of the community. And but because of his prominence, the Bolsheviks didn't quit. They had this thing called the Comintern, where they would it was for communist domination of the world, basically, is what they wanted. But they sent out assassination teams looking for former Russian nobility, and there were 2 assassination attempts on him while he was in Japan. So the prominence kind of was a door that swung both ways, that they knew who he was and they knew how to find him. But fortunately, he survived both attempts.
Now,
but the Japanese themselves were very good to them. Things got a little dicey when the war started, but up until then, they were ranked pretty well.
Right. That's what I was going to ask. Is did things shift when World War II broke out?
Yeah, there was the same kind of suspicion in Japan that we had here in the United States. A lot of people, remember. Well, a lot of people remember that when after Pearl Harbor, a lot of Japanese and Japanese Americans were interned here and sent into camps because people were afraid that they might be spies. And the same thing happened in Japan. Anyone who was not Japanese fell under suspicion. Now, the interesting thing about Sergei, not only was he a prominent teacher at the school, But the Japanese Military Academy brought him in to teach military students Russian. So he was actually employed by the Japanese Military Academy. And even that wasn't enough to keep him out of suspicion. He actually misstated something. He mispronounced a word that was overheard. And there was suspicion that he was a spy. He ended up being arrested and imprisoned for a time in Japan. And then, of course, while that happened, the neighbors are going, well, wait a minute, they were spies or they're not spies? Nobody really knew. So not only was Sergei imprisoned, but then there was this cloud that hung over the entire family while they, until the issue with Sergei was resolved. He eventually was released from prison before the war ended. But yeah, it was, and most of there were a few other Russian emigres. They were, for the most part, imprisoned as well because everybody was, it's fear.
And at that time, you don't have the same kind of international diplomacy like we have now, because a lot of that's sprung up after World War II. So you didn't really have anybody that you could turn to. You're pretty much isolated in this country.
Well, they had the disadvantage also of being stateless. They weren't Japanese citizens. They were Russian citizens of a Russia that no longer existed. So that was useless to them. You're right. They had nowhere they could go to. And they did still have some support from friends. They had a Japanese doctor and his wife that were not only their medical team, but they were close personal friends. And while Sergei was in prison, they provided him with whatever they could provide for him while he was in prison, and took care of the family. By that time, Caleria, Tony's mother, was about 20-ish years old, 21. And she and her two brothers had been educated in a Canadian school in Hiroshima. So they spoke English and Russian and Japanese. So Caleria actually was making a little money teaching English, so the family kept going. But it was a hard time for them. And the neighbors, didn't quite know what to do. Some of them stayed with them and some of them didn't.
And it's not like they could never go back to Russia, because the Bolsheviks just remained in power. As they become the Communist Party, I can only imagine what would have happened if they tried to step foot back in their native country.
Yeah, no, they never could have done it. And the whole philosophy of life was so different from what they knew and what Russia had been and what Russia became. They never would have wanted to go back there. In fact, their goal was to become American citizens, because interestingly enough, when they were playing in the silent movies, musicians they were playing in the silent movies, many of the films came from Hollywood. In that, well, as it still is today, but particularly back then, Hollywood was the sort of the mass production entity for motion pictures. And so as they played in the theater, they were basically spending their nights looking at America and saying, we'd really want to go there. And Tony's grandmother, Caleria's mother, Alexandra, she had a kind of we might call it post-traumatic stress disorder today, a little bit. The Russian Civil War and the escape to Japan was very, very hard on her. And she could not really bear being alone. And so when Sergei was playing music in the theaters, she would take baby Caleria, and go to the theaters and sit in the audience, because she just did not want to be that far away from her husband. She just had that concern. And so basically the whole family sat there night after night looking at America on the big silver screen.
But now the problem is if you want to try to go to America, here you are, a Russian family that's living in Japan. I mean, you would just have spy written all over you unfairly, but that would be what I would think the American government would be thinking if you tried to emigrate here.
Oh, sure. And absolutely no diplomatic connection to anything. Who do you even go to? You show up at the, American embassy. Well, it wouldn't the American embassy, of course, ended with the war, but where do you go? I am a citizen of nowhere, and I want to come to your country. That's kind of a rough place to start from.
Yeah, and I can imagine that it is, especially isolating, an isolation feeling for them, because here it is, the one place you're supposed to be able to go to, the one place that always has its arms open for the tired masses, huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and that it's going to be, the solution for all of your problems, and they won't take you because of the same people that forced you out of where it was that you were trying to, where you were living before. I mean, all those forces are just lining against you. They must have just been so despondent with how things were going.
Well, it was really interesting because one of the things about this book is, we all had a pretty rough year last year. I mean, I don't think last year's events missed anyone. And we kind of, a lot of us, I think, kind of get pulled into ourselves and thinking about how bad things are. You look at this family and how resilient that they were through everything that happened to them. And it is just so life-affirming to read the story of these people and see, no matter what the world threw at them, they kept going and they got through. And I think, aside from the historical aspects of the book, the idea of being able to look at this family and say, wow, people are capable of withstanding all of that. And, if they could do it, I could do it. That was a takeaway for me with this book. But, Tim, there was another aspect of this, is that Claria was the oldest, and then there was Nikolai, her brother, next in line, and then David, who was considerably younger. And Nikolai became very friendly with an American missionary family, and they invited him to come back to the United States with them to go. He wanted to go to medical school at UCLA. So right before the war broke out, Nikolai left for the United States. He was living in the United States when Pearl Harbor hit. So not only did they have the stress of their being sort of outcasts in a way in Japan, but they had their son who was actually living with, the enemy of the Japanese, if you want to put it that way. And so that was another shift. So they didn't know if they were ever going to see Nikolai again on top of everything else. And then Nikolai, when he heard that that his father had been imprisoned, somehow that word got back to him. He joined the United States Army and became a Japanese interpreter for the Army in the Pacific. And he ended up being assigned, after the war was over, being assigned to work with General MacArthur at the surrender ceremony. Wow. And eventually, he became the salvation of his entire family. And in another miracle, he had a 72-hour pass after the surrender ceremony. They gave him 72 hours to go back to the rubble of Hiroshima to, see if there was any trace of his family. And by a miracle, he actually ran into his father, who happened to go back to Hiroshima on the same day. I mean, the odds of it are just mind-boggling. So, I mean,
it's just. I was going to say, it seems like there's a bit of kind of fate working in some ways against them, but also in some ways for them as well.
Oh, absolutely. And because of Nikolai, became Nick. Because of Nick's connections with the government in Tokyo, the family, got some food. Sergei, because of his military experience and everything else, got a job working for one of the military clubs, managing a club, because he also, of course, spoke English and everything by that point. And Calaria got a job working on MacArthur's staff. So, the whole thing was just, it's just a series of miracles. One of the things to me, one of the big things in the book is that the Calaria, immediately after after the surrender, she was interviewed by the United States Air Force. The United States Air Force Strategic Bombing Survey. They went through, they did in the European theater and Japan, they went through and interviewed survivors of the bombings to see how effective their ordnance was. And of course, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was particularly important because those were the first times that the atomic bomb had ever been used. And so she was interviewed. She was the only English-speaking bomb survivor interviewed, and we have the transcripts, the recordings of that. They were audio recorded. So the recordings of that exist, and we had 30-page transcript that we used. So much of a good portion of the book is actually in Caleria's own words that we extracted from the transcripts. And then she also wrote extensive notes after the war and then later on for Tony Drago, who, all his life he'd sort of heard about that. And he said, "Mom, write this down because the family needs to know that." So much of the book is actually told in her own words, which is really completely unique after all these years.
Oh, absolutely. And incredibly fortunate for, being able to really get the true story behind what happened. We're going to take our last break of the night here. When we come back on the other side, we'll get into the bombing, what happened around all of that. And we'll also talk a little bit more about how this story, came to light and getting it back out there and what the reaction has been to it. Let's talk about that, though, Doug. Let's talk about the actual bombing of Hiroshima itself. Certainly something that, I can't imagine that this family saw coming.
No, and that is actually this, I can't even imagine what anyone would think when you're minding your own business, essentially, and suddenly you look around and there's nothing left standing for as far as you can see. I mean, how does that even compute in your mind? I can actually, Caleria, as I say, not only did she have the interviews with the Air Force, but she did write extensively about, that experience, the entire experience from, moving to Japan through the, through the aftermath. But if I could just maybe read you a couple of things out of the book, Jim.
Sure, absolutely.
This is so there's two things here. There's things that she wrote, and then there's things that were on the recordings from the Air Force. The material that she wrote, she's a very good writer, and actually in the recordings, to me, she sounds a little bit like Katharine Hepburn. Amazingly, I mean, she speaks perfect English, but her writing was also very good. So I have something here that she wrote that we put in the book. These are her words about what happened. They were having breakfast, getting ready to have breakfast, and Caleria was, tidying up the house. Sergei, her father, was shaving, and her mother was making rice pancakes. And her youngest brother, David, had been outside, and he kept running in the house. They sent first weather aircraft flew over Hiroshima first to see what the weather was like, because they had to have visual target recognition. So if it was cloudy, then they'd have to go to another target. So a couple of B-29 weather aircraft went overhead, and David was outside looking, and he came in the house and said, "Oh, there's a couple of airplanes." He called them Sammy, or Mr. B for the B-29. And he came running in and said, "Oh, a couple of aircraft." And then the reconnaissance aircraft left, and then the Enola Gay came over alone, a single aircraft. And because it was a single aircraft, there was no anti-aircraft or fighter resistance. The Japanese assumed that it was just photo reconnaissance, and they weren't going to waste aviation fuel trying to shoot them down. So David was outside, and he came running in, and he said to Caleria, basically, he's yelling, "Sammy's right over our old house," he told them. And then he went running back outside. And then he came running back in, and this is what Caleria said that he said. David said, "They've dropped something," he began, "and it looks like a small para there wasn't any noise, just a blinding flash, a shattering concussion. The walls of our house blew in like cards, and we were on the floor, buried in piles of tile and lumber. Then darkness, like pitch black, and a smell. And so one moment, they're standing there getting ready for breakfast, and the next moment, the house is laying on top of them, and they're all buried. Let me get another one here. Caleria continues. I suppose it was 5 minutes before I tried to move. Something wet was trickling in my face. I reached up and felt it. It was warm, probably blood, but it was too dark to see. Perhaps I couldn't see. Perhaps I was blind. My eyes strained in the darkness. She finally heard her brother, David, crawling out from the rubble and crying for his mother. And then she heard her mother answer back. And so she and David both dug themselves out of the rubble and then dug their mother out. And eventually their father, he was in the bathroom shaving, eventually he got out of the rubble himself. And so the three of them had minor injuries, but nothing serious. Virtually nothing was left in the house that was usable, except a few items that they had in a metal first aid kit, and Sergei's violin. Sergei's violin survived in its case. And they went outside at this point to try and figure out what to do and to just look around and see what had happened. They thought that the bomb had actually landed in their yard. Of course, they had no idea. They'd never heard of an atomic bomb, so they had no idea.
Like the scope of destruction, yeah.
Yeah, and so Caleria continues here when they get outside. Look, my father said, pointing off to the south. Through the lightning dark, we could see what he saw. It was the ocean, shimmering blue and sunlit. It was the ocean at Kure, which was 6 miles away. We had never been able to see as far as Kure before. Before there had been a city, a vast city, 6.9 square miles, home of 343,000 men and women. Before there had been a city between here and Kure. Now, if you can imagine crawling out of the rubble of your home and looking to the city where you had been only, days earlier, and there's nothing.
And here you are, a family that has no stake in this. You're not supporting, you're not supporting either side, really.
No. And as another miracle, their house was the house that collapsed on them was in Yoshida, which is about 2 miles from downtown Hiroshima. Their house in Hiroshima, just a few days before the atomic bombing, Japanese troops showed up and said, "We are taking your house to house Japanese soldiers, so you have to leave." And, Sergei said, "Well, wait a minute, I got a family. Where are we supposed to go?" And they essentially said, "That's not our problem. You just get out of here." And so the family moved to Ishida. I think it was like 4 days before the bombing. They moved 2 miles away. That house that they were forced out of was 500 yards from atomic bomb ground zero. So had they not been forced out by the Japanese troops, basically they would have been incinerated along with their house. The 2 miles away was just enough to keep them from being burned, and they were only injured by the concussion wave, which basically took out everything.
And I'm looking at some photos here as we're talking about some of the destruction from this, because it's hard to fathom. It's hard to really think about what it must have been like. And just hearing it described in the words of somebody who went through it, it takes a person has to be the very definition of bravery to just not give up in a situation like that.
Yeah. And that is what I find so energizing. So it's hard even for me to describe how it makes me feel when I see people who overcome these kinds of things. And, I mean, I, like everybody else, I guess, I look at the problems in my own life and, sometimes get a little depressed or despondent about things. And then I look at that and I go, you know what? I have it pretty good. And if they can make it, by golly, I can. And I just find that about this story just so, it's comforting in a way, as I say, particularly after last year where we all had a pretty tough time of it. So I don't know. But yeah, nothing like that had ever happened before.
I was going to say that's also part of the problem, though, is that, you don't have any frame of reference for it. You can't say, that, hey, these people made it through this and they were okay. Being the first ones to experience this, they don't know that they're going to be okay. And even just surviving the initial blast, can you only imagine what it must have been like to think about, not knowing what the after effects could be?
Exactly. And that was something that didn't even come along until later, since nobody knew what it was. The idea that there could be radiation poisoning, and the flash burns were obvious, for everybody. They were, evident. But the other things like radiation poisoning, or one of the things that happened, Hiroshima has several rivers that run through it, and when the bomb detonated, a lot of moisture was sucked up out of the rivers. It picked up radiation in the mushroom cloud and then came back down as these large drops of black rain. Somebody described some of the size of the raindrops as like 1-inch diameter drops. They actually hurt people when they hit them, this black rain. And because of all of the infrastructure essentially being destroyed, people were thirsty. And some of them drank the black rain, which was filled with radioactivity, and then died a torturous death from radiation poisoning. They had no idea.
Yeah, and the worst part too is that you have all this destruction going on around you. You need to, jump in and kind of be part of that community. This community that you never really became a part of, now needs you to help step up and help them rebuild and survive through this.
Yeah, that was another thing. Once they got out of what was left of the home in Yoshida, there, of course, was this firestorm going on. And so there was no point in staying there. They needed to keep going. So and not just them, but just this mass of people started walking out of the Hiroshima area. Anybody who was in the city of Hiroshima was pretty much, they didn't survive. But out a couple of miles, people, were crawling out of the rubble and they were getting out of there. And the family stopped at, they walked for a while. Kaleria's mother, Alexandra, had just recently had cancer surgery and she couldn't go very far. And so they stopped at a house, and a Japanese family had a little cottage, and they asked if they could come in because, they were exhausted. And the family, at that point, it's suddenly like there was no Caucasians and no Japanese. They were all just human beings. And the family invited them in, and they actually took in 9 other families in this little cottage for people who needed to, just get away from the destruction, to rest. And they stayed there, and after a couple of days, Kaleria had been nursing her mother, and she said, okay, now I've got to do something for these people. And she went to work at a field hospital. There was a field hospital not far away. And she kind of had aspired to be a nurse, but didn't have any significant medical training. But she went to the local field hospital and said, here I am, I'll help. And she went to work treating patients.
I was going to say that's really, that's really a selfless act to have all of what's going on around you, and wanting to be the person that jumps in and helps and has to face, it's probably easy to just go find somewhere else to go and try to forget about what happened. But when you're volunteering in that capacity, you are seeing the results of that destruction on every person that you encounter? Every person that you're trying to help, you're reliving what you just went through.
Oh, yeah, I think that Calaria's actions were incredibly noble. Now, she's about, 22, 23 years old at this point. And she had no reason to do anything except care for her mother and her little brother. And yet she had it in her that said, no, I have to help people. In the book, she talks about walking into the field hospital and seeing basically about 1,000 people on a concrete floor not being treated because the doctors and the nurses and medical personnel had all they'd had the same casualties as the rest of the population. So there were only a handful of doctors left to treat people and only a handful of nurses. And medical supplies were virtually nothing. And of course, nothing to treat the flash burns or anything like that because nobody even knew they existed. And so there were all of these people suffering. And for Calaria, sometimes the best she could do was just go and hold their hand. I'm not going to read the quotes from it, but, her dealing with children, for example, and just holding on to the children. There was no way to treat them, but just to hold their hand and talk to them until they died. And so it was incredibly noble of her. I can read you a little something from the hospital experience.
Sure.
I'm going to try to find something that's not incredibly graphic. Not that it's, a terribly graphic book, but, it is a little emotional when you're talking about these things. This is a quote from her. I think this is actually, this is from the Air Force recordings. When we put this in the book, because she was being interviewed, on tape, her answers are all spontaneous. She didn't have any opportunity really to think about the answers. So on the tapes and the transcripts, sometimes she's correcting herself or grammar gets a little goofed up for a minute, because it's spontaneous. I didn't change any of that because I thought that it was better to just leave her emotions intact on that. I think this is from the Air Force recording. Anyway, she says, and they didn't have anything to treat. Basically, after the initial bandages and things ran out, they didn't have anything to treat patients yet except mercurochrome and cod liver oil. That was the extent of their medical supplies. So it was just a horrible situation. But she talks a little bit here about patients. Yeah, and I'm quoting her. There were about 4 different kinds of patients. The ones that died off within 2 or 3 days. They died because of heavy burns. If people were burned more than 1/3 of the body, most of them died. Then there were kinds of patients that lived for maybe a week. They died from inhaling the gas, I think, and their heart weakened, and they died of exhaustion, I would say. Then there was the kind of patient that lived through the burn. Their burns got well, but in a month's time, they'd find their hair falling out and a very high temperature, and their throats would become very sore, and they'd turn very pale green, and then they died off. And then there was a 5th category where they say the people that had been in the area of the bomb 2 kilometers in radius cannot live more than 3 years. I don't know whether it's just a rumor or fact, but that's what the Japanese police have said to people. And the people that had burns on their faces or hands or anywhere could not live more than 3 years, even if they got better. The people that were badly burned, they vomited all the time, absolutely no intermission, but vomited and vomited, so they couldn't take in any water or even ice. So you can imagine being in a facility and having about 1,000 people like that. And essentially all you can do is try to provide as much comfort for them as you can. As I say, I think that was an incredibly noble act.
And there's a reason why we hopefully will never have to drop another one of those again.
Boy, absolutely. Absolutely.
So for the family now, after all this happened, what was going on with them overall as a unit? We're talking about what Kaleria was able to do to help, but how did the rest of the family deal with the after effects?
Well, Sergei Palchikov, he was an incredible man. He just, despite everything that was going on, he just didn't quit. So he continued. They'd been removed from one house. They had another house collapse on them. And he just went out for a walk and said, I'm finding a place for my family to live. And he found a place up in the mountains that, wasn't nice, but it was a place to live. He took care of the family and got everybody together. And they particularly had to care for Kaleria's mother, who was still not doing very well. And it was interesting that there was in insurance policies for the citizens for war damage. And so on one day, he decided he was going to walk back into Hiroshima, where there was an insurance adjuster who sat on a curb once or twice a week and handed out insurance payments in cash to whoever could get to him. And so Sergei walked into Hiroshima, which was a long walk from where they finally ended up. He walked down to Hiroshima and stood in line to get his insurance payment. And while he was standing in line, Nikolai got his 72-hour pass. And on that particular day, at that particular time, he went into Hiroshima. He found his house. There was nothing. All he found was a brass knob off his bed. That was all that was left of their house. And then he just started driving around Hiroshima looking for anything, and he found his father. I mean, that's incredible. He came up and got out of the car, and he looked at this line of people, and there was his father. And so at that point, he was able to, basically come to the rescue of the family. He got Sergei, a job working with the Army, and Kaleria working for General MacArthur. And then during that part, she met Tony's father, who was a GI. And eventually they managed to get the entire family back to the United States.
Can you just imagine, too, what it must have been like? And maybe they spoke about this a little bit. Maybe you were able to find some notes on this. But, we're talking about this happened, I think, August 5th. And so then you've got until the 15th before the war is over. I mean, do you think they were just living every day, looking up in the sky, worrying about every plane that flew over after that?
Yeah, well, of course, I think the surrender was declared on the 11th. Nagasaki was bombed, I think it was on the 9th. But basically, yeah, from that time in between, they're just waiting for the next one. I mean, and I think that's probably why Sergei went to the little town up on the mountain. He figured that probably would be about as safe as you could possibly get, because there would be nothing up there to bomb. But that's essentially everyone at that point, from what Kaleria wrote, was just waiting for the next one. What worse can happen to us? I mean, it's just how horrible, waiting to have survived that first flash of light. And it made no sound. It was just a flash of light. And then suddenly everything was gone. And so you're sitting somewhere wondering if it's going to happen again and when. Terrible.
Absolutely. So now the family was able to make it to America at some point, or some of the family.
Yeah. First, Kaleria came to the States and she married Tony's father. And then a few years later, Sergei and Alexandra and David also immigrated to the United States. Sergei became one of the founders of the Russian language program at the Army Language School. You remember now we're into the mid-50s, the Cold War has started up. And so now, between his military experience and multi-language capabilities, Sergei got a job teaching American soldiers how to speak Russian. And in a little miracle for Tony and I, one of Sergei's early students by the name of Tony Turk found Tony Drago and said, "Your father was one of my instructors when I was in the Army." And he gave us a tremendous amount of information on not only on Sergei, but on family history. So that was really incredibly helpful to us. But so Sergei had a career working for the Army Language Institute, and you know, and they had a pretty good life. And Caleria and Tony's father lived in New Jersey for a while, and then Los Angeles, and then, you know, it was quiet. Caleria did not want to talk about that event at all. She kind of tried to put it to bed. In 1986, they were having a big event in Japan, and they started looking for survivors of the bomb, and they found her. She was living, as I say in the book, she wasn't hard to find. She was in the Long Beach phone book. And they invited her back to Hiroshima for a ceremony for not only the bombing, but for the school where her father had been a teacher. And she went back, and it was like confronting her past and just sort of working through all of that. It was a very emotional situation. And Sergei's violin, which had survived the World War I, the Russian Civil War, the escape to Japan, the atomic bombing, they gifted that violin to the school where he had taught for so many years, and it's still there today as an honored, you know, memento of his time there. So it's one of those situations that actually had good closure for Caleria and for the survivors, and just generally for, you know, there was, in a sense, a sort of happy ending to the degree that's possible in this situation, where there was closure for her. She could sort of put a cap on her life and say, okay, that's it.
And of course, you know, we've only been able to really scratch the surface of the story here. If people pick up the book, they'll be able to get so much more, and as you were saying, so much more of it in her own words. What would you say, though, is the thing that you want people to take away the most from, you know, reading this story and hearing it firsthand from Caleria's point of view?
There would be 2 points, I would say. First is that this is a much of a first-person view of that event, written from a standpoint of someone with a sort of Western worldview rather than a Japanese worldview. And it's a first-person account of exactly what happened that is very relatable, I think, for people like us. We look at that and say, oh, I can imagine myself in that situation. And the other part of it is just the heroism and the refusal to give up. It's the indomitable spirit of man that you look at that and you say, wow, look at what she did. Look at what they did. If they can do that, then by golly, you know, I can survive too. I can do something like that. If it's in them, it's in me. You know, as I said, most people had a pretty tough year last year, but you look at this kind of demonstration of the strength of humanity, and you go, you know what? I can get through this.
Absolutely. The perseverance of the human spirit is something that, you know, can be an inspiring thing for no matter what struggles that you're going through. So certainly everybody can head on over to midnight.fm, pick up the book there. You can also go to Doug's site as well, DouglasWellmanAuthor.com, also linked up at midnight.fm as well. Doug, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this incredible story with us.
Oh, it's so good to be on your show again, Tim. I'm very, very happy to do this.
No, I love talking with you, for sure. Keep us up to date with all of your projects.
Will do.
All right, take care. Have a good night and have a good weekend.
Good night.